begin. 3009, well actually this block in particular is really important to notice because each of the houses represents a different style. There are Georgian colonial revival, Italian villa, many different styles represented. And so, I don't know, it's a look at early Richmond suburbs along streetcar lines. The Collard Park with a buffer for all the commercial area along Chamberlain and Brooklyn Park Boulevard. So, wait, this is Jeff Stewart Elementary School. It represents one of the sort of golden age of public school architecture in Richmond. It was built in the 1920s. It's a classical revival school, which you can tell because of the pilasters, which are the brick columns in the wall, and the moldings above them. And this bay is very distinctive. We just wanted to point it out because it's a gorgeous school. And they actually just received some national awards for being an excellent elementary school and it's a great place to raise your kids. And it's
all right. You'd be hanging the left over here. This all developed around the 1920s and 30s to provide services and amenities for the developing neighborhoods over here. All this area is called Highland Park. When it was first developed, the area south of Brooklyn Park Boulevard was Chestnut Hill. The area north was Highland Park. They were owned by two different developers, or groups of developers, but these separate groups had a lot of the same businessmen associated with them. So at a certain point, they decided to consolidate those developments, call it Highland Park, and shortly thereafter it was annexed by the city. So this stretch here reflects the businesses that a neighborhood in the 1920s and 30s would want. Right at the intersection, it's called Trims now. It's an Art Deco building with arches. That was one of the early filling stations. There are actually a couple of them. The building right next door to us, that sort of Spanish mission-style building, that was another filling station in the neighborhood. One of the earliest commercial buildings in the neighborhood is just on the other side of First Street. It's a two-story building with a false mansard roof. And that was originally the Stay Clean Inn. It was spelled S-T-A-K-L-E-E-N. I always thought that was sort of a modern thing, but I guess they were doing it back in the 1920s as well. What we're standing in front of right here is the old firehouse. It was built in 1915 to serve the area. It's a craftsman style. The engines were housed in this central portion, and they had living quarters on each side. Now it's run by Boaz and Ruth, which is a community-based nonprofit. They also have another store building over there, and they do a lot of community outreach. One of the things they do is they provide re-entry services for people who have been incarcerated who are working their way back into society. They do a lot of job training stuff. Right here, this is their restaurant catering service. I've not been there yet, but so they have a great early bird breakfast special, so I'm going to come check it out sometime.
She poked her head and said if we want something to drink.
Oh, great. Well, there you go. Very, very nice people here as well. What we're going to do is hang a right onto First Avenue. If I remember correctly, the trolley line that came through this neighborhood came up Meadow Bridge, so we're sort of along that stretch where it ran. We'll hang a right on First. If you notice, the commercial buildings extend a little ways up Meadow Bridge as well. But we're going to be getting into the Highland Park Plaza area, sort of Highland Park proper, and our next stop will be another little group of commercial buildings up by the park.
Hey, I got something to add. You see that concrete pole over there? That's what the cables for the cable cars used to be suspended from.
There you go.
So whenever you see those around, there's some crumbling ones on Main Street, but
Yeah, they're 100 years old. And boy, someone show it. That one's in excellent shape compared to a lot of them. Sure.
Anybody like some water? Oh, thank you so much.
I'm Darlene.
Thank you, Pearson. We're doing our bike tour. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you.
An early streetcar line actually ran up by the park. That is Plaza Park, which was built by the developers to promote this neighborhood. And then you had this little commercial board or strip that developed to serve it. That building right there was an early filling station. I don't know what the rest of these were specifically, I know there was a barber shop, there was a confectionery, like a candy store, there were a couple grocery stores. So you look at it now, and it's maybe hard to imagine what it was like in the neighborhood. The streetcar line right here, you can come here and take care of your errands, but it's cool to check out. And some of the architectural styles, you've got sort of the Art Deco-ish right here. You've got this, again, this sort of Spanish mission, Spanish colonial.
Did you say that was the filling station?
This was the filling. This very simple building was the filling station, actually. And it's funny because that was around 1925. That was built. Some of the ones at 6 Points have a lot more architectural character. There's Art Deco, there's sort of craftsman style, and it's interesting that even the early gas stations, they took some pride, or they made it a point to make their buildings distinctive.
Right there at the curb.
Oh yeah,
that's really convenient.
Yeah. All right, so as we continue on, you can look over into the park.
Yeah, sure. Great road, made it from station to station.
That's just smart, yeah.
We're going to make one more cross across Brooklyn Park Boulevard, which is kind of the hairiest point. So the officer's here to clear things up for us. So if we could just let him do that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Sorry about that before, guys.
So there's not a whole lot that I wanted to say, but I just wanted to point out this church because it's another example of how architecture, especially high styles of architecture like Gothic, was brought to a neighborhood, an early suburban neighborhood of the city. This is just a nice small church. Now it's called Northside Crusade Baptist Church. To point out the pointed arch windows and the castellated parapet. It's just a nice thing that you stumble on it.
And as we turn onto 4th Avenue, we're back on what was Richmond Street. And you'll notice down here just a little ways, we go by a couple commercial buildings on the corner. It's sort of interesting. One of them, it's still a commercial store, and it's open. The one across the street is boarded up, and it looks like a house. It was built, instead of doing one of these like Art Deco style buildings, they built it to look like a residential building. So you'll notice it's boarded up on the corner. So we're going to continue down along the old streetcar line. All right, Tyler's going to tell us a little bit about this because he's the expert here.
Oldest Catholic cemetery in Richmond. There was one earlier cemetery. You know, one thing in the 19th century, if you're Jewish or Catholic, you need to have consecrated ground where you be buried. And so this cemetery was founded after the Civil War by the German Catholics. You notice these names like the Siderdings and a whole bunch of German names, some of which may be familiar to you. And so this was consecrated in 1874. Still a very active cemetery. They kind of overbuilt. It's got the most amazing brick wall in the city of Richmond, which was built by a German-American brick contractor. I mean, really, you will not see gates and walls like this. And it runs all the way around the cemetery, which means about 5 acres. I think what's kind of cool about this, it gives you a really nice perspective on the natural topography. Richmond was all kind of cut up into ravines and hills, and these plateaus, as we get here down to the creek valleys, would form spurs. And Chestnut Hill, that we're in right now, is one of these spurs. It's not very wide. We're at 1st Street. When you go over to 5th Street, you're right at Interstate 64. The Chaco Valley Bridge comes across, and Interstate 64 runs right along. It's a very narrow little district. Barton Heights on the other side of the ravine is a little bit wider, and we're actually going to go down, and you're going to cross the I forgot the current name of the bridge, but the old well, actually not so old, the new 4th Street Bridge. And then we're going to go down to Shockoe Hill, which is on the other side of this valley. This is Cannons Branch Valley, and the idea, I noticed they started clearing off the right-of-way. There's a big city right-of-way, and you can see the creek bed. Richmond Henrico Turnpike is a narrow little road on the other side of that wall. And so the idea is eventually to have follow the line of Richmond Henrico Turnpike all the way out to almost the Henrico Canyon line, almost all the way out to the fairgrounds. That's a pretty little valley. Unfortunately, one of the things that's been happening is that there's a lot of illegal dumping that goes on down there because it is kind of isolated. And occasionally I'll ride it early in the morning, but it's a snaky little road. It's not very bicycle friendly, but it's a pretty valley. And so this really gives you kind of a nice sense of what this, and we actually crossed this over. Basically, we followed Richmond Henrico Turnpike down to Brooklyn Park Boulevard, and basically, if you kept going straight, you would come right down here. The house over there, which has not got a user, is an interesting building. I forgot the name of the owner. It's 1840s house. It's one of the oldest houses on Northside. And one of the things about Richmond was that in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a lot of Richmonders with some means had country places. Call them what you will, villas, plantations. Some are more working farms than others. Some actually had mills. And basically all of our city park, many of our city parks, Bryan Park, Bird Park, Forest Hill Park, were these country places. And that's there are a couple of survivors around, and that's an original one. So we've come through, when we're up at the park house up in Maryland, Milton, that's the Highland Park District proper. This is Chestnut Hill. This is also called Highland Park Southern Tip. This was all the town of Highland Park over in this east end on this side of Cannons Branch, and basically Barton Heights, which we're going to come back up to, is on the other side. The other thing, there's a really neat history, and there's a wonderful gentleman, Mr. Bowling, who's wrote a really good history. These iron crosses are pretty neat. These were the Catholic nuns that served St. Mary's School, which no longer exists. Jackson Ward, the eastern half of Jackson Ward was actually called Little Germany along 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And St. Mary's Church, I think, was at 5th and Marshall, somewhere kind of down in there. It was torn down in the 1950s. And so these monuments were constructed for them. Obviously, they had a standard blank in which they put them out, but don't see a lot of cast iron funerary monuments in the city of Richmond. The chapel's a little bit later, it's 1950s, and they actually have a tremendous amount of land. They bought, there's much more land than there's German Catholics to bury. It still is an active cemetery. It still is very much an active cemetery here, and they do a really nice job of keeping up. But it just gives you a nice sort of feel for the train. And then Cannons Branch is going to run down into Bacon's Quarter Branch Valley. Bacon's Quarter Branch Valley runs from Shockoe Valley way the heck up past Maggie Walker School, really all the way up to the boulevard. Up in that area is Bacon's Quarter Branch Valley. So that kind of gives you a little overview here.
Are these crosses from Tredegar?
Oh, I don't know. There were a whole bunch of cast iron makers in town. It's hard to say. Could have been. There are no marks on them, but there were. And the Germans were very involved in the iron foundry business, so maybe it's somebody that connected.
One quick footnote: the pews from St. Mary's ended up at St. Edward's out in Bon Air.
Oh, okay. And all the German Catholics moved, or many of the German Catholics moved to west of Boulevard, and St. Benedict's and is a successor congregation to St. Benedict's.
And the Sheedy family, which you see right behind you, were out on Shank Road and German School and Forest Hill.
Yeah, there's a huge, before the Civil War, about 15% of the white population of Richmond, and I think the state true probably on into the latter part of the century, were European immigrants, and big groups. There were some British immigrants, but the two main groups were the Irish and the Germans, and German Jewish folks, German Protestants, and German
Richmond.
Go ahead.
Richmond had 2 German newspapers too at one point too.
Yeah, it all kind of went south after the First World War. There was a lot of repression in German culture during the First World War, and German language became very unpopular at that point.
Yeah, the other cemeteries, where are they in relation? They're like over, what, that way?
They're on the other side, yeah, and to give you a little bit of the cemetery history, since we're going to talk about this, you go by, and I highly recommend check out Hebrew and Shaka, which we're going to go right by.
We'll see those.
You'll go right by those. And so what happened was in the 19th century, or early 18th century, pretty much the tradition was to kind of not be too concerned about where you put bodies. Now there was a church burial ground at St. John's Church, which filled up very early. I mean, by the early 19th century, it was pretty much full. So, and then there's the Franklin Street Jewish burial ground, which actually was somebody's backyard that basically was just done for burial. And the city did a pretty cruddy job with treating African Americans. There was the Negro burial ground, which you may have heard about, which is under basically Interstate 95 and a lot of fill. And then there was a potter's field, basically on the other side of this ravine, and they actually plowed through it to build the viaduct across the ravine in the 1890s. And Frederick Olmsted came here and described that thing. So in the period after the War of 1812, a number of groups worked to get actually decent burial facilities. We're going to go, we will see the Barton Heights cemeteries for a little bit. Those were started in 1815, and the African American community basically saying, we're going to take care of ourselves, you know, and these burial associations were formed, and they bought land, which was really kind of out in the middle of nowhere, not very accessible, not very easy to get to, long before there was any suburban development. And then Hebrew Cemetery was given to the Jewish community of Richmond in 1816. Basically, the Jewish community was looking for consecrated ground where they could have them bury their folks. And that's been there since 1816. They've expanded a bit. And then Shako Cemetery, 1822, is a generation ahead of Hollywood Cemetery. Is a generation ahead of Hollywood Cemetery and basically John Marshall and all the people of the early 19th century. What's going to happen is that starting with Hollywood Cemetery and continuing after the Civil War, there are going to be all these rural cemeteries, bigger rural cemeteries, 10, 40 or more acres, like Hollywood. The city has Oakwood, Riverview. The Catholics will form Mount Calvary. The town of Manchester will organize Maury Cemetery. So the cemeteries get much bigger. So the cemeteries here, including this one, are kind of earlier, relatively smaller cemeteries. This is, I think, about 5 acres. Shako, that you're going to buy, is about 5 acres. So these are a smaller cemetery, but again, trying to migrate out to the sort of edges of the city for burial. But they're really, really nice little green spaces that we've got going. Oh, and there's going to be in July. There's going to be, you may say, there's going to be some Edgar Allan Poe event at Shako Cemetery. Sounds good.
There's several that are unmarked over there. I mean, there's Black, Slave, I thought.
You'll see Barton Heights cemeteries. The Barton Heights cemeteries basically were condemned and acquired by the City of Richmond, and there are marked monuments, but the City of Richmond in the 1930s basically plowed through and cleared out a lot of the early wooden monuments and markers. So a number of the graves in that cemetery are unmarked. There are some monuments in the cemetery, but I think it's thought that there are about maybe as many as 20,000 people over in Barton Heights cemeteries. There are a tremendous number of people there, and that cemetery has really been reclaimed by folks. There's an excellent history of African American cemeteries in Richmond by a woman named Veronica Davis. And if you're interested in cemeteries, put a plug in. You can read my book, which has, I think, a pretty good section on cemeteries. It's called None Such Place, A History of the Richmond Landscape. But so the cemeteries are really kind of the precursors to the suburbanization. And the other thing that's worth pointing out, this was really inaccessible in the 19th century. Northside was very, very inaccessible. You basically would have would have, you know, could have taken Richmond right to Turnpike. Brook Road was another way you could have gone, and the Meadow Bridge Road was, but the accessibility here was not really good. And so in 1890, the real estate companies, basically the transit companies, the real estate companies were all one and the same. They were, and there was all sort of a collusion to basically sell real estate, sell tickets on the streetcars. And so these viaducts, which you're going to cross, the predecessors to these, were built, and this basically opened up Northside to develop. There were also Chamberlain Avenue was done in the early 20th century to improve transit to Northside. Brook Road, eventually there was a colonial road, but there was actually a viaduct for the streetcars that went from Broad Street. There's this really neat classical building at Laurel and Broad. That's the Ashland streetcar terminal, which actually there was an elevated streetcar line that came into there. So basically Northside's getting all opened up starting in 1890, running real through the Great Depression because of streetcar service. And even you've seen a lot of garages. Basically, you know, the early residents here might have had a garage, might have had a carriage, but the term Sunday driver comes from the idea that you just had your carriage and you would use it to get to church. But during the day, you know, everything is, you're going to everything in town. And this was a pretty sweet arrangement because it was a very quick ride down to Broad Street. It's very much in the center of town. There are commercial districts up here that you've seen, but they were very much kind of localized. If you were going to go to a theater performance or do any kind of shopping or anything, or really work, there was no employment up here other than the shopkeepers. You would be taking the streetcar right downtown. The other thing about the way the streetcars suburbs are in Richmond, they're all basically on the west side of town. You're either northwest, due west, or southwest. That's because we've got prevailing westerly winds. Richmond's a dirty, coal-fired city with paper mills and all manner of bad belching stuff. So if you look at a map of Richmond, everything's kind of very much sort of westward oriented, and this was kind of the Elysian fields out here. The idea that you're going to have a big lot, that you're not going to share a common wall with somebody else, that you're out here in a more environment. And so the lots, you know, the lots here are very generous in size, 40 and 50 foot wide lots compared to a 20 or 30 foot wide lot down in the center of town. Notice there are no attached houses up here. Everything is detached. And if you look at the early photographs, everybody had a garden up here. It was pretty, and you know, people kind of kept that tradition going to some extent.
Well, you've heard the story about the demise of the streetcar going to Ashland. They pulled up the rails in 1938, sold the steel to the Japanese.
No. Well, I don't know about the Ashland line, but basically the streetcar lines were, the Richmond lines, all the streetcars were taken out to the freight yards in the east end of town, burned in 1949. If you've seen the film, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about, oh, well, GM did this, and you know, I think, I don't buy the conspiracy theory, but basically in the late 1940s, the streetcar system was 50 years old. It was old infrastructure. Streetcars weren't heated. I think it was, rather than put a major infusion of dollars in the streetcar system, gas was really cheap, rubber tires were really cheap. It was just a much more efficient system to go to the bus system. But if you look at our bus system today, I would say that probably 60 or 70% of the lines in the municipal bus system, these are in the process of being changed, have their roots in the streetcar system.
All right. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, John. Yep.
Did he just live here? Or I'm preempting you.
That's good. Fine.
Did he just live here during the time of construction?
Yeah, I believe he was only here a few years and then run out of town. And I don't know that sort of intermediate history of the house after that. James Barton's mansion that Bill Martin mentioned earlier. It was built as a showpiece for the neighborhood. I think it was the first large house built here. It was the early 1890s. And the streetcar line came right up the road we just came on, and it hooked a left on Poe, but at that time when you would have come over, you would have seen this, you know, right up in front of your face, and it would have been a pretty impressive selling point for the neighborhood, I think. What you can't really see down there is that's actually that same Cannon Branch Creek. And when this house was built, there's an area down there. It's now a public park. It's called Mitchell Springs. And way back in the day before this area was developed, that was sort of a wayside springs where people would come out and picnic, that sort of thing. And my understanding is that when this house was built, it was a landscape terrace that overlooked this park. And it's hard to imagine now, but it's something to think about. We've actually been working with the owner of this property. At some point in the mid-century, they added that large two-story wing, and it was an invalid's home. These folks bought it not too long ago. At the height of the real estate bubble, wanted to put another rest home in the house and couldn't get the financing together. It's just a huge project, and so they're trying to sell it right now. Unfortunately, this house would cost so much to rehab that in this market there just aren't that many interested buyers. But I'll put a plug in if you know anyone that's interested in Corner Minor, the Barton Mansion. It's available. It's on the market. So our next stop, we're going to curve around and stop at a house. They call it the Wingnut. It's a local group that just moved up here recently. They're sort of self-professed anarchists, activists. They have a little community garden, a little bike co-op. We're going to stop by there, and they're going to give us a little spiel just to give you an idea of what's going on in the neighborhood now. I don't know how incendiary she may or may not be, but it's adding I think some positive energy to the neighborhood. So we'll stop there and see what they have to say and continue
I
on.
have a real quick question
sure.
that I doubt that you can answer for me, but what's that? I've got the 1920 census, and my dad was less than a year old at that point, and he was born on Poe Street.
Okay.
When I tried to find the number 1812, I couldn't find it. Was it common for them to renumber?
Yeah, a
streets
lot of
like
times especially in these areas, because they were independent cities or towns for a little while, and when the City of Richmond annexed them, they would have to change the numbers to match up with the numbers in the city. In some cases, in Highland Park, for example, there was a Virginia Street at Highland Park, and they had to change the name because there was already another Virginia Street in the neighborhood.
Okay.
You can find out what the number was by the Sanborn maps that are available at the Virginia Library, or Library of Virginia downtown, which is accessible online. You'll be able to pull up those maps, and they show the old street address and the new one.
Okay. What was the name of the?
The Library of Virginia.
No,
Sanborn?
Sanborn?
Fire insurance company. They would make maps
okay.
all over the houses.
If you look trade emails in on
Yeah. Okay.
That's a more recent edition, mid-century. It was a rest home.
Hey, are you guys dying of the heat?
Almost.
A little bit?
We're on our last leg.
Okay. Yeah, I looked at the map, but I couldn't tell which direction you were starting in. That's cool. Yeah, this is the Wingnut, and this is our house. It's a radical collective, and so we live here like not as like a technical family, but friends who are all working on similar projects. And so we do stuff like Food Not Bombs out of the house, where we cook a meal once a week and take it to Mineral Park and give it away to free whoever wants to eat it. And we started doing like a free kids breakfast on Friday morning since the kids are out of school for the summer, and a lot of kids get their breakfast usually at school during the school year. What else do we do? I don't know. We do like craft nights and movie nights, and we have acoustic shows.
Oh, he's actually with us. He's our SAG wagon. Yeah.
Are the police cars with you?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the other one's against us. They're all against us. So you're involved in the civic association here. And
yeah, I'm the corresponding secretary of the community association for this neighborhood.
And what's I know you've written about you're doing like sort of bicycle co-op.
Yeah, we want to, we're trying to get it started because we need to get another space to like store bikes. But a lot of people in this neighborhood rely on bikes with a bus system to go to grocery stores or whatever, but there's not a single bike shop anywhere, and there's not like anywhere to fix up your bike. You have to go far away to get that done, but if your bike's broken, you can't, and then you can't get to your job or the grocery store or whatever. So like this is a neighborhood that we think would really benefit from having some bike co-op sort of thing going on. Yeah. Yeah.
Any updates on?
No, we're still working on a proposal for that property. Yeah, we're trying to buy the property across the street to renovate it because it's owned by the Public Housing Authority, and they don't have a good process for like doing anything with their buildings. So we'd like to see that fixed up instead of just, you know, empty and dangerous.
Not for profit, it's a complete money trap, but
That one actually, it's owned by a guy that lives a street over.
Yeah,
and
he lives
we're
on
actually working with him. He's in the process of rehabbing it.
Yeah, it's gonna look really nice. We got super excited when they started tearing down the nasty asbestos siding and revealing the wood. We're like, yes, that's great.
House.
Yeah.
And your house is great too.
Yeah.
Who did the mural?
We all did.
Oh,
There's like 10 of us that worked on it.
A few of the neighbors helped out with some drawings and stuff for it.
Yeah,
It was built.
I've never
1922.
22.
Yeah. When we bought it, it was condemned and vacant, and it had like I had to get the electrical and plumbing. We had to redo all those, and it had lead paint, which is like one of the major issues with older houses. Is like the lead paint abatement, and we were lucky because we did it before the EPA just changed all their stuff like a couple months ago. But we did it all ourselves, you know, acting as our own general contractor and doing the lead abatement ourselves. So it's possible, or at least it used to be. I'm not quite clear on the new rules that they've got on that, but
If you do it by yourself, you don't have to.
you don't. Nice. Yeah, I mean, you just have to have them come out a lot. Just be nice to the guy, the lead paint guy. He's pretty nice.
They'll love us, so we did good that way. Well, thanks a lot, though. This is, I was telling these guys, this is kind of the sort of energy that I think is great to see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We don't wanna
the
just
city
live here.
refused to put trash cans
Yeah.
on our street, so we've been slowly buying and putting our own trash cans in.
Yeah.
We do a trash cleanup like maybe
Every
once
other
a
week.
week.
Yeah.
Kids always help out. We have like 20 kids.
Yeah, there are a lot of
every day,
kids in the
like
neighborhood.
Like 13. That's awesome.
Did you guys just get in touch with them by being out and around?
Yeah, we first started hanging out with them actually when we were working on the garden. Some of the kids came up and they were like, "What you doing? Can I help?" We're like, "Yes, you totally can." And then I don't know if anyone knows about Facebook and that video game Farmville, but some of the kids were like, "This is just like Farmville." And I was like, "No! Farmville is just like this."
That's the real thing.
You're so wrong. But they really like to learn stuff, you know. So kids love being able to come over and help garden, or we help them fix up their bikes as best as we know how, because we're not bike mechanic skills at all yet. But you know, we do what we can. So yeah.
This is Barton Heights.
This is Southern Barton Heights.
Southern Barton.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, and keep up the awesome work.
Or have a good bike ride, y'all.
Thanks. Plenty of water.
Put your names there.
Yeah, I know Southside Community Development has a couple signs up, and some other private developers have done some other things. So this is Barton Heights Cemetery. Tyler mentioned it a little bit. It dates back to the around 1815. At the time, there were, I believe, roughly, I may have this number wrong, but I believe it was around 2,000 free men of color living in the city of Richmond, and they wanted to have their own burial ground. They didn't have it until that point, so they got together, organized a group, and bought a parcel of land right over here. At the time, they called it the Phoenix Burial Ground, which I think is a very poetic name. Over the years, other similar groups, either just freestanding groups of free black men or groups affiliated with African American churches, purchased other plots. And what happened is you ended up having roughly 6 different contiguous black cemeteries on this 12-acre parcel. Some of the more notable people buried here, or who were originally buried here, there was one guy, now I'm blanking on his name, but he was a barber, or maybe it was a blacksmith, actually, I can't remember, but one of the two, and during the theater fire at where the Monumental Church is now on Broad Street, he rescued over a dozen people, and I think he ended up dying around 1840, and he's buried there. Another notable person that was buried there was Reverend John Jasper, or Jasper John.
Sun Du Move.
The Sun Du Move, the famous sermon, and he would travel the country giving this sermon, and his home church is right over in Jackson Ward. he was buried here in 1901. When he died, apparently they had thousands of people out here and all sorts of dignitaries commemorating the event. Unfortunately, as the town of Barton Heights began to grow, they started putting some pressure on the owners of the cemetery. They weren't too happy with the condition of it. I think part of it was there was a racial element. Barton Heights was an all-white town. They had this black cemetery in their midst, and the town attorney brought a lawsuit against the cemetery, threatening to shut them down. And what ended up happening was they resolved it so that the town of Barton Heights could set rules for the cemetery. They could have rules for when burials could happen, rules for maintenance, upkeep, that sort of thing. When the town was annexed by the City of Richmond, the City of Richmond also took over the cemetery. And during the Great Depression, the WPA was involved in some landscaping work, some of the fencing you see, that sort of thing. Another unfortunate result of that decline is that a lot of the folks that were buried here were disinterred and reburied elsewhere. Woodland Cemetery, where Arthur Ashe is buried, just over that way, is where some of these folks were later buried. And right now, I don't think a burial has taken place here since the 1970s, and the City of Richmond is the entity in charge of its upkeep. So if there aren't any questions, we'll continue on our way. I'll point out as we round this corner on Rose, if you look to your left, there's a really nice looking historic church building and house that you would normally not see just traveling down here because it's obscured by this modern infill. Giles, any more stops after this? All right, so we're just going to wind our way back actually up to the stone house. So.